It's truly a great honor and a great pleasure to be invited and to be with you on this extremely important day, which reminds us of history, but also warns us about the future and the attention we need to pay to these issues of violence against women. The attention we need to pay to feminicide issues as well. I'm going to give a little background to my talk, which will be based on and anchored in research data that we have been conducting within 2 consortia for several years, namely IPV-Propol and IPV-Dakavid. As you can see, we have studied the relationships between intimate partners, both from the point of view of public policy and from the point of view of the dynamics and trajectories of violence and exiting violence, also at different times of crisis and post-crisis. I'm also going to refer to some very recent data collected by Eurostat on the prevalence of violence in Belgium, one of the countries that took part in this major survey, which involved 15 European member states and 3 other member states. So I'm really going into this data so that together we can think about what the statistics can tell us and the paths that can be taken through the statistics, whether they are relevant or not. I'd also like to remind you that this intervention, and our entire career as clinical researchers in this field, is always carried out in a context of collaboration with practitioners, and also with the perpetrators and victims of domestic violence. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them, because without them we obviously wouldn't be able to produce all this data. And finally, as a court expert and a therapist and psychotherapist, I have also taken the liberty of clarifying certain points in my comments from my own clinical experience. As you know, you're never alone when you're doing research, so here we have a few representatives of the team and researchers who have taken part in the research process over the last 6 years, from different universities, research centres and disciplines, so that we can gain different perspectives. With regard to today's presentation, I'll start by putting the context in which we operate in Belgium into perspective. Belgium is a long way away, but you will probably be able to draw parallels with your political reality here in Quebec or Canada. And we can see that various advances have been made over the last decade or decades. Prevalence data. We're going to think together about these prevalence data and then, based on a cross-referencing of research data, I'm going to consider both the pathways taken by victims of violence and, if I have time, the pathways taken by perpetrators of violence. I frequently mention at the beginning of my lectures that one of my friends is Yuri Bronfenbrenner. I think he's a friend to all of you too, because he offers us an extremely interesting frame of reference, whether it's sexual and gender-based violence or domestic violence. He invites us to think about all the systems involved in the emergence of domestic violence. But these different systems and the interaction between them, the societal context, the legal, legislative and administrative frameworks, the practitioners, the frontline workers, the families and the child's social environment also interact in the process of the exit from violence. I'm going to put you to work here too, so we'll all be working. Don't hesitate to rethink through these different levels because they are extremely decisive and they evolve. If you take, for example, the societal context, just as in Quebec, in Europe, in France, and in Belgium, there have been major changes in social norms concerning stereotypes, also concerning the recognition of this violence, and we can think that these transitions are still underway and that we may even be in the midst of a major transition. This is particularly true in relation to consent, which is now on the agenda, especially in our criminal justice system, and also in relation to coercion in the context of domestic violence, which is not yet recognized as a criminal offense, but which is integrated into the understanding of the dynamics underway. So we're in a transitional phase. But beware, these transitions can also suffer from regression, because at this second level, we have political frameworks which are present and which can obviously have an influence on the progress of these transitions, which can also, like the desistance process, move forward, regress, move forward. And that's why your presence here today, why your work and your practices are extremely important in enabling this transition towards recognition, towards care, towards support for people leaving domestic violence. So I think that the reality in Belgium, France and Quebec regarding domestic violence is somewhat similar. Do you think so? I see nods. Indeed, I would say that the realities are somewhat similar. That's why I took the liberty of comparing Belgium and Quebec. We can have all these images that can appear as soon as we make a work of association, thought, or images relating to domestic violence. And probably very quickly when you think about the path of domestic violence, when you think about the relationship you're going to have with a victim, you're going to say, well, leave him. This is often said both in the psychosocial intervention sector and in the social environment of victims of violence. And this, leave him, also calls on us to think about how precisely to enter an exit pathway. This, leave him, which may seem obvious, which may seem something that seems so, I would say, natural, to escape violence, obviously faces many challenges, many adversities, and many risks too. There were 21 feminicides in Belgium in 2024, and around 20 in Quebec. The context of separation, in particular the context of leaving a violent partner, is a particularly high-risk context in certain situations in terms of the risk of death. So there have been some major advances in terms of policies and the framework in which we operate. I'm not going to develop them fully, as Charlotte can do that in her presentation. We come from the city of Liège. Well, I say we, but not Charlotte because she's in Brussels. But we did base our work at the University of Liège. So the University of Liège was the initiator of many policies on domestic violence. And in 2004, a Crown prosecutor became tired of seeing so many cases being classified without follow-up. As a result of this high number of cases being dropped, he promoted a zero-tolerance policy. In other words, the perpetrator of any violent behavior should be interviewed and action taken. This initiative by Prosecutor Bourguignon has been extended to the whole of Belgium and is part of the zero-tolerance policy that Charlotte Van Este has assessed. Other initiatives include the Domestic Violence Resource Centre, which will focus on training and awareness raising for professionals, and will roll out a whole series of actions that will also be multi-sectoral and will involve all frontline professionals specialising in domestic violence. And then, in 2011, the Istanbul Convention. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So it's a convention adopted by the Council of Europe that is fully in line with the fight against violence against women and gender violence. States have signed this convention, have ratified this convention. Signing this convention implies committing to this policy of combating violence against women. So ratifying the convention is binding. It is the first binding legal instrument which will force us to develop policies in this area, and each country must develop action plans. And Belgium has been developing action plans since 2001. These action plans are really aimed at developing knowledge, raising public awareness, prevention, detection and assistance for victims. There's a real focus on victim support, but also on appropriate follow-up for perpetrators, and finally the implementation of an appropriate police and judicial approach. Countries that have ratified the convention are evaluated by Grevio, which checks and assesses whether the country has indeed adopted a whole series of actions. So we can see that it really is a very important, very structured instrument that will provide feedback depending on whether these different policies have been followed. We are currently following the 2021 to 2025 National Action Plan, which aims to combat gender-based violence. Another high point in our political, public, criminal and penal landscape is a reform of criminal law, of sexual criminal law. So before, we didn't talk about sexual criminal law. Now we have a sexual criminal law that has placed at its centre the notion of consent and the need for consent at different times in the relationship that you have with your partner. So here too, even if there is no major change in the incriminations, the fact of having really reformulated this penal code through consent becomes an instrument to intervene and to participate in this framework that we saw with Bronfenbrenner on how precisely consent is going to be part of the landscape and in collective representations, in beliefs, and so on, and the research that is currently being carried out. I have several theses and works on consent, but we haven't yet reached, I would say, where criminal law would like to take us, particularly in relation to this representation of what an established couple is in relation to consent. But that's not the subject of today's speech, so I won't digress. And then, once again on the initiative of politicians, I would say women politicians too, who have really worked to highlight the issue of domestic violence, we now have the Stop Feminicide Act, which is not a criminal law, but an administrative law that will once again raise awareness of this issue. It will also help to record the facts. So we have structurally included consideration of these feminicides with a view to taking action in the field of prevention and objectifying these phenomena. Then there are public policies, in this case criminal policy. I would say that here too, there has been a great deal of progress, and a number of circular letters have been issued, setting out guidelines for temporary bans on residence, the harassment alarm, and risk assessments. These circular letters will also be evaluated, bearing in mind that not all boroughs and not all public prosecutors will implement them in the same way. So there are differences between regions in terms of application. This also shows us, I'd like to put it in these terms, that both in the political world and in civil society, as well as in the legal world, we have people who are making progress, developing and committing themselves to action in the field of domestic violence. During the crisis, these various circular letters were updated, and their application became even more stringent. Once again, this will be covered by my colleague Charlotte, who will talk about it at greater length. What about the definition? As you know, it's important to know what domestic violence is and what it's called. As you can see, we talk about violence between intimate partners. Others refer to domestic violence, and there is not necessarily a consensus on this term. And we have a definition that has been proposed within the school framework. This definition, I'm going to present it through the elements that have been discussed as part of the researches, but also through focus groups that I conducted here recently. Over the last 2 months, we have used both definitions and prevalence data from the IWEPS research. Also prevalence data on what exists in Belgium. We are surrounded by experts from different sectors to discuss this data, so I took the liberty of referring to it, because it also allows us to use this focus group method again, to go and discuss collectively the knowledge we have or the objective data, to be able to move forward. In the context of this definition, you've certainly had time to read while I was speaking. First of all, I'd like to point out that in our IPV Propol research, we saw that there were tensions in relation to these definitions. There are many definitions, but there is no consensus. This feminist dimension, which is relatively firmly rooted in our territory, in the French-speaking world, is not unanimously accepted. So it's important to be able to highlight this as well, and these data from 2019 to 2020. So there are tensions even in this definition. Why am I interested in definitions? Not to do intellectual work. Because these definitions will determine. The interventions will also determine the collection of data that we can have, but they will also determine the motivations and justifications for the interventions. What is currently being called for, particularly in the focus groups, is to be able to use a generic name or term that includes gender-based violence. So the notion of gender and sex, not only sex but also gender, and also to include male victims, so as to have a broader vision of domestic violence, and perhaps also to face up to certain resistances that are present as soon as we adopt a position that can be read solely through a feminist lens. And finally, its intersectional dimension is truly essential today. It's interesting and important to be able to take into account the multiple vulnerabilities that intersect and make for plural oppressions among victims of violence. You certainly have a lot of videos as well as capsules, don't you? Do any of you know this one? Okay, all right, you know. Well, it's not generally that well known, even in Belgium. In 2012, campaigns were run to prevent domestic violence. I'm going to give you a little snippet so that I can continue what I have to say.
Marie, c'est quoi ça?
Ça quoi?
Espèce de robe, là.
La rouge?
Bah ouais, la rouge.
C'est ma robe pour ce soir.
C'est une blague. Tu vas quand même pas mettre ça.
Elle est très bien, cette robe.
Tu ressembles à rien dedans. T'as vraiment qu'un goût. Je vais t'en trouver une, moi.
C'est quand même pas toi qui vas choisir ma robe pour ce soir.
Écoute, tu discutes pas. Tu vas me faire confiance, ok? Quoi? Y a un problème? Moi, j'ai un problème. J'ai checké ton Facebook. T'es ami avec Alain, maintenant? C'est quoi, ce plan avec Alain? Marie! C'est quoi, ce plan avec Alain?
C'est Alain, c'est ton pote.
Ah oui, justement. C'est mon pote. Et mes potes, c'est mes potes, tu comprends ça? Mais pour qui tu te prends, hein? Pour qui tu te prends? Tu fais rien de tes journées, tu te plains tout le temps. Hein? Et maintenant tu fais la belle devant mes potes? C'est ça, hein? Oui, tu te crois où, toi? Mon amour. Je suis désolé. En fait, je trouve ça plutôt sympa que tu sois pote avec Alain. Bon, tu te grouilles. Je vais voir pour le...
I won't go on. You can go on at home because they're available on the Wallonia-Brussels Federation website, and they're also available on YouTube. 2012. So these capsules have been around for 12 years. And at present, even if a structured evaluation has not been carried out, we can ask ourselves what effect this dissemination and prevention through this type of capsule is having. And I think it's frightening to see that the effect on the public is not at all what was expected in relation to citizens. And when we talk to young people under the age of 20, they will tell us, that doesn't apply to us. It applies to people in established relationships. So we're missing them. When you work with perpetrators of violence, they'll say, I don't recognize myself, it's not me, it doesn't work like that at home. If you work with victims, they'll say, No, but no, our relationship is quite different anyway. So I ask questions. And we're really looking at how and what media we can use, in terms of primary prevention, in terms of violence, and I don't think these videos have been shown much. So I'll come back to what I said about definitions and what the experts in the focus group said. We also had a number of experienced experts. In any case, what was said is linked to the video we've just seen. It's important that the definitions include relational processes, coercive control, and domestic domination. It's important that the notion of coercive control, of micro-regulation of everyday life, should emerge in order to understand the mechanisms of domestic violence. There is a duty to be trained in understanding and reading the phenomena of violence through coercive control, microaggressions, and micro-regulations. You are certainly aware of what I think. You have training plans that focus on coercive control. But it is to say that we have a duty to be trained in these subtle dynamics and processes which are often understood as so-called ordinary violence within couples and which are not seen or identified as violence. What about the numbers? So I'm going to tell you that we need numbers. Numbers are essential to objectify a reality. We don't have enough numbers. And that's why in the scientific literature, we have a host of studies and surveys designed to validate and assess the numbers. But beware of the numbers. Be wary of numbers, because they can obviously be put to good or bad use. If you see this in terms of psychological violence, it's a survey. So we have 5,434 people. It's a representative sample of all segments of the population and all social classes. And with a sample that was predominantly female, the countries had the option of also carrying out an assessment among men. So a whole series of questions were asked to assess the various forms of violence, and a whole series of items were included to produce statistics. Both men and women experience high levels of violence. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 3 men experience psychological violence. So we're in a bit of an imbalance here. Gender-based violence, sex-based violence, and so on. We go a little further, but it's true that physical and sexual violence will establish differences in prevalence in the case of these self-reported victimization surveys. So we can see that they are more represented. If we go a little further, and as researchers we have a duty to go further, we can see that when we look at the frequency and types of violence to which people are exposed, we can see that the vast majority of women suffer several types of violence, and more frequently than men. So objectification through figures also means that we need to look at the dynamics at work and the processes at work. If you want to understand the exits from domestic violence, if you just have a prevalence figure based on behavior, you can't understand and develop and decode the dynamics. If you go further into these data in terms of frequency and accumulation, you have these processes of escalation and accumulation which show us that when you are trapped in this type of violence, you are obviously weakened and in greater difficulty in terms of escaping the violence, this exit from domestic violence. I won't go into detail as you can read about it in the slideshow. In fact, when we talk about the different types of violence, we're going to break them down into the different items that are questioned. It's really interesting to be able to look at which types of behavior are most commonly reported by women in the general population, and which are most commonly reported by men. So this is not to hide a reality that men can also experience. It's precisely to make our point about violence based on sex and gender. And we can see that 75% of female victims of violence will refer to humiliation and insults. Just as an aside, I conducted a study with one of my doctoral students on slut-shaming in adolescence. So this really refers to the humiliating insults that are made. And what we see is that when young teenagers are subjected to slut-shaming, there is a really major psychological impact in terms of depression, anxiety, and self-image. This means that the trivialization of slut-shaming that is taking place in our society, you see Bronfenbrenner's framework in society, is having an impact on teenagers. But here it is also having an impact on adults. Doing things to intentionally scare or intimidate you, such as yelling and breaking things. When there is a small asterisk, it means that there are significant differences between men and women. It's an experience that is reported much more by women. Control over the victim's social contacts and activities. It's a relationship of domination, which can also be seen in the fact that the victim is not allowed to ask permission to leave the house. So we have a higher prevalence of female victims. In the very nature of the dynamics, there is a difference, which means that on the one hand, it's important to look at women. It's also important to look at men in order to understand the dynamics at work in violence against men. But what we see at the moment, if we take the whole of this sample, is that women are more likely to be confronted with certain types of violence. In particular, these last items, which refer to threats of violence against loved ones, which will be part of parenthood in particular. An attack on parenthood remains a form of violence that is still understudied, but which nevertheless has an impact that spans several generations. Nearly 1 woman in 10 said she had suffered such violence. It's a huge number. So this difference in the type of violence highlights forms of behavior that are linked to situations, particularly of domination and dynamics, which hinder the exit process. So getting out of domestic violence and saying, just leave him, is a challenge. It's a challenge that will obviously depend on internal resources, on the processes that will be at work internally for the victims. It also depends on external resources and the interventions that will be carried out. And it's even more difficult for vulnerable women. We see much higher prevalences among women with several types of vulnerability in terms of insecurity, disability, health and inability to work or unemployment. So there we have the intersectionality. There are still others, such as those assessed in the IWEPs, which require greater attention in relation to these vulnerable groups, in relation to domestic violence. Then, just as an aside, because we are studying it a great deal at the moment, there is also a definition of harassment in intimate relationships. If we look at all the individuals who reported having experienced harassment by a third party, we can clearly see that an overwhelming 97.8% of them were actually harassed by a former partner. I was really quite impressed by this figure, because in almost all of the cases, it involved the ex-partner actively using various strategies to harass and attempt to regain control over their former partner. And this is indeed, in any case, a very significant period of risk. So getting out of violence and supporting victims and perpetrators to get out of violence is also a real challenge for professionals. Professionals have a responsibility in how they intervene to help victims and perpetrators exit the violence. So I'm going to make a reference. I'm going to refer to certain models with which you're no doubt familiar, and to certain elements of the research we've carried out. I've taken them up again because I think they've once again proved to be relevant, based on the latest data. So first of all, it's important to understand the processes and dynamics. Based on quantitative data, it's also really important to get to grips with subjective experiences. What is experienced from the point of view of this woman or this man? What is it like for them? So this subjective experience, which is not always used in quantitative research either, is really very important, and we really wanted to be able to consider it, particularly in the study of life paths and trajectories of violence and exiting violence in the IPV-Propol research. We met a large number of victims and a smaller number of perpetrators because it's very difficult to reach them in this research. So we had 88 victims and 19 perpetrators. And among the victims, we also had a number of men, which also enabled us to discuss certain data in terms of gender and sex. So perhaps I'll skip the methodology. So the idea is just that, in terms of recruitment, we've chosen not to say, you're a victim or you're a perpetrator, can you testify? We really did put out a very open invitation. You're over 18, you've been involved in violence, would you like to take part in a study? So, in fact, they didn't identify themselves as perpetrators or victims, and it was through their stories that we were able to identify victims who were also perpetrators at times, as well as perpetrators. We took a very open approach using the life calendar and the macadam model. It was also to be able to solicit the story as openly as possible, which gave rise to stories and interviews that could range from 1 hour to 4 hours to 5 hours, depending on what was produced. So we carried out a thematic analysis, which enabled us to model these processes of engagement and exit. And so here we have an image of a life journey in which the entire relationship with the spouse or spouses has been identified. The timing and the time frame could be anything from a few months to a few years. For one of the victims, it took 26 years of violence before an exit from violence could be considered. Some were not yet in the process of exiting violence. They were still involved in violent behaviours. We also analysed the institutional pathway to assess how these people had evolved through the intervention system and the various interventions that had taken place. I'm not going to give you all the results, but you can access the summary of the research in your university. And the research, the book, is also available on the website. I wanted to add something, but it slipped my mind. I'll get back to you. Firstly, I'm not telling you anything new here. It's important to remember that violence between intimate partners takes many forms. It goes well beyond the 3 forms of violence that are present in all trajectories. But there is also everything to do with the instrumentalization of children, coercion, sexual coercion, control, and economic violence. These issues are currently the subject of a great deal of study, and they have really come to the fore this week in Belgium, in the media, and in the testimonies that have been given. As we saw earlier, we often find ourselves in a situation where these forms of violence are combined. What I wanted to highlight with this diagram is that when we think about exiting violence, remember that if you are experiencing multiple forms of violence, it is all the more difficult to exit that cycle. All the more so as experiencing violence will have multiple impacts on your health, physical health and mental health. And impacts that are often understudied, but which will nonetheless leave their mark on the person's life. They will create vulnerabilities with regard to exiting violence. And the risk, however, is that these factors, in sentimental terms, which are the consequences of victimization, may be seen as a risk factor in terms of being subjected to violence. So there is a reversal of these elements rather than seeing them as a real impact and consequence, particularly in the field of legal expertise. We can see that this person had depressive mental problems that could be considered and accepted by the court as a factor that could justify the violence. So you're telling me, no, it's not possible, but it is possible because this drift happens very quickly. These associations that we have included in one of our collective representations are being revived at a very high rate. So we can see that these impacts are really going to be felt in different spheres: the private sphere, the health sphere, mental health, the professional sphere too. And they will clearly limit people's possibilities. Statistics show that the prevalence of depressive disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder is much higher in people who have experienced domestic violence. Then, being able to understand this violence and being able to think about the exit, including interventions, constantly brings us back to Walker. So I've put it here, this cycle of violence from 1979. This cycle of violence can be broken down into 4 stages that ultimately lead to a return to square one. I'm not going to go into that here either. But in this research with our 88 life trajectories, these cycles of violence were intimately and flagrantly part of these stages. And this cycle of violence is in itself a real trauma, even a complex trauma for the victims, and once again hinders them from leaving violence behind. Not only will this cycle and its various stages, through which the violence passes, hamper the way out, but it will also lead to inconsistencies in the response. Because the temporality of the victim's evolution in this cycle of violence is not going to be the same temporality as the practitioners who are going to find themselves at stages with a delay. So there are real discrepancies, and it's difficult to connect with the victim's reality and validate it. In the life stories, this was very much in evidence, the feeling of not being understood, of not even being in the same time frame, and of not being, I would say, recognized in what is experienced. So I have the same image with the intervention arrows. You can really see that there's a gap like that in relation to this. Very often in expert reports, when the expert report comes after the hearing, after the forensic examination, etc., I have victims who come in and say, "This isn't violence and I want to withdraw my complaint." It wasn't violence. It was cocaine that did it. It was an argument, and I'd like to withdraw my complaint. It is not possible to withdraw a complaint, but we see this position. There's a gap because the legal time frame is not the same as the clinical time frame, nor is the psychosocial time frame. So here too we see obstacles to leaving violence behind. And this also bears witness to the spiral of victimization through trauma, which leads to self-blame and self-responsibility on the part of the victims. Walker also discusses this. So that really has a major impact on the entrapment in relationships and the reversal of responsibility. It also has a traumatic dimension, which is also present at the moment, and trauma can lead to dissociative processes, which will also hinder the search for help and the exit process. So let's get back to the data and then we'll come back to the process. In fact, one of the things that is going to get in the way of taking violence into account is the failure to identify this violence as violence of any kind and the trivialization of this violence. So you can see that in the research carried out among the victims, half of them say that in the end it was wrong, but it's not legally punishable. We're referring to a framework that will make it possible to trivialize and justify. It's not serious, it just happens. Here we have a whole series of factors and obstacles to identification. The reason I'm taking a little time to point this out is that it really does seem to be a key moment. This transition from non-identification to identification, for both victims and perpetrators. And there are many factors involved, on different levels, psychological factors, factors relating to trauma too, which will lead to dissociation, a break with this experience of violence. And then there are factors linked to the relationship with the perpetrator, which are perhaps not often taken into account or taken into account too little in research, and institutional and contextual factors. In the focus group, a participant was able to explain. I'm going to take the time to read it because it seems to me to be very interesting and perhaps insufficiently reminded. Integrating the reality of experiencing abuse in an intimate relationship is something extremely distressing, anxiety-provoking for the human psyche. So there is recourse to defense mechanisms, otherwise there is a collapse. The recourse to denial can be facilitated systemically, as my colleagues have just said, by a lack of knowledge of professionals, a non-recognition of the system in particular, of coercive control. But this also means that, in terms of support, and in my practice, it is mainly at the helpline that I experience it. The lifting of denial must also be something gentle, non-moralizing, non-brutal. And that the professional must also accept the time and the process that it takes for victims, for relatives, for the perpetrator, so that this lifting of denial and the full and complete measure of the extent of what is experienced within the home is accepted, is formulated. Well, there is still this dimension that we should not ignore. And that's why I've taken the liberty of including it here. This question of newness, temporality, and the time needed to recognize oneself as a perpetrator, to recognize oneself as a victim, is not an insight that just comes. It's not a process that can be integrated or internalized by a single intervention, because the psyche is much more complex than that. Living with domestic violence means protecting oneself from domestic violence at a psychological level, and getting out of violence also implies a time frame that can take time. And as we saw during the COVID crisis, there were emergency interventions, and this time was not respected, with deleterious effects in many respects. I'm going to finish with the first part of my speech. Once again, a few verbatims from victims. Firstly, because I think it's important to give them a place in the room today, and secondly, because these verbatims also helped us to model the exit route. He wears you out. He wears you out. Until a certain point, you are reading a recipe you don't know. I remember that this is what struck me the most, and that's when I called the CVFE. I couldn't read my recipe, turn around on my work surface, and remember what I had just read. So I said, "Now, GN, you no longer have a mind. Now your brain is completely filled with manipulation. Physically, my teeth are decayed. I don't have the money to treat them, so my teeth hurt all the time. I'm tired. I don't have the courage to cook for myself anymore. I'm tired. I sleep. And my doctor knows this. I spoke to them on the phone again. I mean, I'm not refusing help. But I can see that they, like me, see that there's nothing to be done. So at one point, my lawyer wanted me to be hospitalized, but I refused. By saying, what's the point of going to a psychiatric hospital? I've already worked there. Now it would really be killing me. It's really proving all these people right that I'm really crazy. And they'll never give me back my children. Here, you have an illustration of the various issues involved in requesting assistance, as well as the impact that certain interventions can have on a person's experience, which can be either drivers or obstacles to escaping violence. The problem is that no matter how much we know and hear, our entourage tells us, you've got to get out of here, it's not for you, it's no good. You're going to stay. I think that when you're not really 100% aware that you can do it, you won't do it. So, when you're not 100% aware of your power to act, you don't have it. This brings us back to the notion of empowerment, which also calls for interventions to support this power to act, which has obviously been altered by all the mechanisms associated with violence. So we studied these trajectories, and in these trajectories, without going into detail, just to say that these trajectories are very variable over time, they show that more often than not, there are multiple acts of violence perpetrated and suffered by the intimate partner, and that there is also the importance of the environment in the context of this violence. The social environment, formal and informal support, which I'll come back to, and this process of leaving, which is a time that will come at a given moment on the basis of certain elements that can promote awareness. In any case, a change of perception in the relationship will be able to continue with an alternation of different stages, not in a linear process, but with a regression and a return to later stages, and will have a combination of elements relating to thoughts, beliefs, and cognition that will be reviewed, cognitive distortions that will also be adjusted. There are also social, contextual, and interactional elements in the relationship with the partner. Clearly, the social resources and support available in the social environment and in the field of intervention. These resources are also going to be crucial in terms of these possible exits. And we know that isolation and geographical isolation, and you are certainly more familiar with this in your country than in ours, are widespread. Geographical isolation will also greatly weaken these people. Based on these trajectories that we have analysed, hours and hours and hours. And above all, Amandine Diever, who is my researcher and who wrote her doctoral thesis on this subject. She helped us to model a process that will set out the different stages in the process of exiting violence based in particular on, and this is what emerged from the trajectory as a whole, based in particular on, at a given moment, a change in the perception of the relationship that will lead to, if you will, lead to a shift. You are shifting away, deviating from the position in which the victim may have been trapped, ensnared for many years. And it can be factors or elements, I don't know, triggering situations of many kinds that can lead to this, and which will therefore also lead to a form of identification of what is experienced as violence. And so this process can be very long, or it can be shorter, so it's very variable in terms of time. The first stage is to question oneself. Question oneself of one's own responsibility for the violence. So even when the violence is identified, you're not going to be able to point the finger at the perpetrator as being responsible for the violence. But there was a questioning of one's own responsibility that you can obviously read in what we saw earlier about the spiral of victimization. And it's only at a later stage that the partner's responsibility can also be questioned, I would say in the context of the violence experienced. And once again, there's a gap in relation to this self-attribution of responsibility, and then a form of decision-making about the need for change. So there has to be a change. So there can't just be an end to the violence, there has to be a change. And that's where different resources and different strategies come into play to bring about change. You can draw parallels with the wall care cycle, except that here, it is applied a little differently, and this necessary change will be attempted in many ways, and then may, in any case, in the situations we have seen for the vast majority, lead to a decision to leave, which may eventually be realized in relation to the different resources present. That's when it's really important that there is support and a whole series of safeguards around the victim, the children, and even the victim's family and friends, so that this departure can take place. And this departure does not mean an end to the violence we saw earlier, that this post-separation violence is really present. So I think we're going to be able to give the floor because we have the mechanism. So on the one hand, you're going to say to me, well, this modelling might seem like something we know, something that's latent, but you have to remember that it's really rooted in a thematic analysis of these hours and hours of interviews, and that's what it comes down to. Which also means that what was already highlighted in the 80s, we are dealing with mechanisms that are still relevant in 2020, 2021, 2023 in people's lives. We need to question ourselves on this issue. We have also worked on the trajectories, on formal and informal support. And, in particular, those around the individual play an important role. And we can see that listening, availability, and the support that the environment can provide are the first agents of support. But we can also see that certain reactions from the people around will also disrupt and act as a real brake on, I would say, these exits from violence with warnings. Warnings that can be repeated and that can really make people feel guilty and increase their sense of guilt. There are also elements of family, community, and cultural values that can either act as a brake or a facilitator on these exits from violence. Or, in any case, In terms of raising awareness, we can hope that all the actions that are being carried out over these 14 days here all over the world, not in the whole world, but in some parts of the world, can also help to raise awareness. In fact, the attitude that practitioners will adopt, these attitudes really do have a value, a really central function, particularly around non-judgment. Again, this could be banal, but it's something that's very, very present. Victims expect to be listened to with kindness and, above all, without judgment, because talking can awaken a strong sense of shame in victims. All this is obviously what the victims have told us. So it's not, I would say, a starting point. It's really what was mentioned. So this feeling of shame, which is totally debilitating and a poison that fills the whole person, can easily be intensified by the attitudes of professionals. Attitudes from both loved ones and professionals. Another means of identification that was verbalized and stated was the internet. In fact, everything on social networks. We were surprised to see how receptive people were to this. So I think this is another medium that could be used more for prevention, because there's a process of identification that takes place through this medium, which is ultimately one of the media that we all use. And then there's the peer support, which means really being able to talk to other people who are going through this type of situation, in an exchange that echoes and makes it possible to hear something that was experienced. But with this person who is 2 or 3 steps away, or even a few kilometers away, you can also help in the process of identification. What about the police and legal procedures? We talked about informal support. We saw 2 sides of the story, or at least 2 different experiences. On the one hand, there was a real perception of supportive help from the police, who acted as intermediaries between a whole series of structures. On the other hand, we also heard something completely different, which was to say, above all, don't go. Don't go because the risk is too great that the youth services will be called, that your children will be taken away from you, that you will be disqualified, and so on. So there are really these 2 perceptions, which tend to focus on the risk of reporting, of seeking help. For the risks, particularly for mothers, of being deprived of their children, of having them placed in care, of being, I would say, used as instruments in the conflict. So these 2 elements stand out in the content, and yet we can see that the police appear to be a support and a relay when it comes to leaving violence behind, particularly in terms of the guidance that can be given. And there was also the feeling of security from the police intervention, its presence, which was also expected, the notion of safety. However, the confrontation with the legal system was often described in terms of anger, frustration, and a feeling of injustice, both for the perpetrators and for the victims. With impatience, with this time lag, which has ultimately led to a very high level of dissatisfaction with the procedures, in relation to a lack of information, to the process, to this focus on providing evidence, which ultimately sends out an implicit, if not explicit message about the need for evidence. To be able to validate a reality that is intimately experienced and has an impact. And with a presentiment of disbelief on the part of the judges. As I said yesterday, in psychological assessments, we are asked to assess the credibility of alleged victims of domestic violence. Obviously, they find it very difficult to deal with, since it ultimately positions the psychojudicial intervention as casting doubt on their words and experiences. So what they need, what the victims need, is counsellors who are accessible, who listen, who take into account the psychological stage of the victim, and who have a truly understanding attitude with tools that help them understand the paradoxes in which they find themselves. Domestic violence is really a metaphor for paradoxes. Paradoxes that give rise to contradictory feelings of powerlessness and omnipotence in both victims and perpetrators, and that can also affect practitioners, sometimes leading to paralysis. What about psychosocial help? So we can see that these frontline professionals are really a lever for recognizing the dynamics of violence. And here I'd like to come back to this notion of temporality, because it's quite phenomenal when you look at it. The extent to which this temporality leads to disparity and ultimately causes us to miss out on many situations, possibilities, receptiveness, opportunities for relational attachment, and the possibility of adhering to the treatment plan, to the protocol, and the proposals we can make. Once again, the needs are to increase accessibility, ensure confidentiality and discretion when the violence is disclosed, promote the development of a sense of assertiveness, autonomy, and long-term follow-ups. So what they were able to say, in any case, is that the follow-up will be stopped very, very quickly. But that this medium and long-term follow-up is necessary for some of them. So follow-up and support, but also psychological follow-up and psychosocial support is mentioned. Which brings me to the conclusion of this point, but not the whole speech, that recovery is a long road and that this timing, this temporality, is not recognized, I think, by the political authorities, by the various authorities. And so if recovery is a long road, it also requires long periods of support to enable recovery, to enable this resilience. And here we have gaps in the chain. And so we also need to sequence interventions in relation to the different stages and objectives of intervention through therapeutic alliances. What about getting perpetrators out of violence? Obviously, I can't finish without mentioning the perpetrators of violence, and I'm going to go very quickly, but once again, there's a publication available that shows the modelling that was done on the basis of the 13 perpetrators we met. These perpetrators are somewhat forgotten, at least in Belgium, because the focus has been on victims. For the perpetrators, we have fewer mechanisms. We have one main system, which is Praxis, which is the accountability group, and we don't have that many systems, which is why yesterday's speech was unable to show that there are measures to be taken. These measures also require support. And the perpetrators are often subjected to temporary residence bans and other measures, but without any psychosocial support, to which they are not necessarily receptive. Let's be consistent, I'd say. Ms. Van Estey will also show you, on the basis of statistics, the angle taken by criminologists, namely recidivism. And I would also like to invite you to consider another paradigmatic framework, that of desistance, which looks at the exit of violence. Not just domestic violence, but violence through complex non-linear processes involving interaction with subjective, social and interactional elements. In fact, thinking about domestic violence from the angle of desistance brings the focus to a paradigm that is not the risk of recidivism, even if this is not neglected, but on the process of change that is underway and how we can support it. So, in fact, we need to look at these two dimensions, and we are more concerned with assessing the dangerousness of the risk of reoffending, which is very important. But on the other hand, there is also the whole desistance aspect, which remains understudied. Little research explores it. Because we're in a dyad, and we also need to think about desistance within this dyad. So in the context of desistance, we're going to look at the process of change, identity transitions. And we're also starting from the premise of the observations we've made that, on the one hand, desistance doesn't happen by chance. So it doesn't just happen spontaneously, with an aspiration that comes along and leads us to get out of the violence. It requires commitment. So there is a dynamic of commitment to change that is expected of the perpetrators, which will lead to a redefinition of self and identity. So it's a conscious choice that will be facilitated by interventions or by assisted withdrawal, which is a concept that was strongly developed by Isabelle Dufour from Laval University. And so this awakening, this conscious choice will encourage this process of change. There are 3 levels that appear in the testimonies and stories. The first stage is I am not. I am not violent. I am not a perpetrator of domestic violence. There really is this positioning, which is very common in my clinical consultations and also in the praxis groups. So it's this definition of I am not that appears as a survival of identity. So it's an extremely violent process, as we said earlier, to recognize oneself as the perpetrator of violence, which often echoes experiences of violence as a child exposed to domestic violence and other traumatic experiences. And so it really fragments and destructures the person. I'm not the man you're talking about. There's a lack of recognition of oneself as an author. There's really this impossibility of identifying oneself through violence, and therefore not sharing the conceptions of violence we talked about earlier at the beginning, because it's impossible to integrate that into one's discourse. So it is a rejection of this identity as a violent man. I include it in this process because we see it as a process involving multiple interactions, but also the human psyche, which is extremely complex. But if I'm not a violent man, who am I? So here we come to the question of identity. And this question of identity can be explored in terms of how domestic violence becomes part of a person's history. And then we'll take a good look at the whole sequence of this history, which can also make sense. It's not about being stigmatized as a perpetrator of violence, but as violence that is part of a life trajectory and that echoes or responds to a particular need, a particular dynamic, a particular model, etc. So we're dealing with a more complex issue here. So it's really a question we're asking. What makes me what I am today? So this question, which was founded by McAdams, is really a very interesting question, and I invite you to ask it. Obviously, you can ask it at an appropriate time. If you ask it during the first interview, it won't work. The timing is very important. And so, finally, there is a whole series of paradoxes. This questioning of identity in relation to violence, and this perception of violence as not being the responsibility of the perpetrator, but the responsibility of the other. I am violent, and in fact, I will wait for the other person to ensure that I am no longer violent. So it's going to refer to expecting my partner to be like this, like that, for things to happen like this, like that. And so we're going to see this expectation that's going to establish the position. Let's change without changing anything. Let's call it change without changing anything, which leads to stagnation and calls for a transition in relation to the commitment to desistance. And it's this transition that will involve potential hooks for change. These are events that can also contribute to change, but in any case, they will involve a new awareness. We may not like this new awareness, but it's about being able to integrate the fact that we are the perpetrators of violence. And that is a prerequisite for the paradigm of change and the new paradigm of the self, these new self-awarenesses. So increasing the self-attribution of responsibility and refraining from being violent again requires being able to recognize that the behavior is violent, but also that you can do something to change the behavior. If we're just at this notion of recognition, of identification, then after that it's free fall. The process is stopped. So there's a need to work on 2 axes, change and the possibility, a positive projection of oneself, other than from the point of view of the violent man and from the point of view of violence. So this notion, I would say, of recognition, which will lead to responsibility and also to agentivity and the fact of really being able to be seen by those involved as agents of change. And that requires positive attributions in the long term, and not just from the point of view of violence. I don't have time to develop this further, but it's this process that calls for responsibility, not from the point of view of disintegrative shame, but active and positive responsibility from the point of view of reintegrative shame. Judicial sector. What the perpetrators say is that there is a Manichaean vision between the perpetrators and the victims, that they don't feel heard, a feeling of injustice in relation to the attitudes and decisions of the judicial players. The confrontation of acts, which takes place in the context of hearings in particular, is experienced as very stigmatizing and is likely to disengage the perpetrator rather than engage him in a process of recognition. We also need to think about intervention strategies. So it's up to those involved, and in desistance it's really a postulate, it's up to the professionals to care, to create opportunities for identity transformation. So there are these shared responsibilities where professionals have to be able to create opportunities for change through quality, attitude, and intervention. We know that the quality of relationships and attitudes have a very significant impact on the person's subsequent commitment. In the psychosocial sector, there is a paradox between too many constraints and too little monitoring. So it's experienced as far too many constraints. Why? Because there's an injunction to provide care, to follow up, so you don't have a very clear, well-defined motivation. At the same time, there is also a need for more psychosocial intervention. So there really is an ambivalence about this which is recognized and present. And then, all the perpetrators had passed through praxis. There are many different experiences of praxis, but I don't have time to go into that in detail. But we can see that praxis can be a support for resistance and the reinforcement of resistance, but it can also be a vector for change. To conclude my comments on the experience of interventions, we can see that there really is a springboard. There is a springboard between the balance of too little or too much and the need for individual space. Even if we know that the transitions are not a commitment, as in a spontaneous help or a spontaneous request to this process, which is going to be followed and which is declined in the various verbatims. So I don't want to finish without mentioning those who have been forgotten. Exit from violence means working with children. Exit from violence means working with the children who have been exposed to domestic violence, because they are also part of the next generation where this exit, this beginning of violence, will take place. So I'm calling on all the projects that are going to work on research. Clinical work too, with children who are exposed to violence and who develop defensive mechanisms and mechanisms that will cut them off from a reality that will catch up with them at some point and that will seriously destructure and risk destroying the individuals and people they are. And here too we need research, so I'm calling for research projects to be submitted in relation to this, and obviously for interventions. So we will end with Bronfenbrenner reminding us that the way out of violence must be read, heard, and thought through at these different levels. Thank you very much, and I hope I haven't gone on too long.